I often talk about the strategies that we can employ to help each and every one of us deal with isolation and confinement and constriction that comes at time of quarantine, but also in terms of self-care and self-improvement throughout our lifespan. Now more than ever before, I believe we really are in need of managing our own self-care with wisdom, activity, as well as an eye toward Tanakh. So what I want to do is talk about where some of these ideas come from, as well as lay out for you the different strategies that I think have been helpful for my patients in my private practice, as well as in terms of the way I see Tanakh and the world that we live, that contemporary man and woman living. I want to start by first mentioning that every one of us in this time of quarantine and confinement is going through a version of our own traumatic stress. And the side effects of trauma for all of us are threefold. Number one is a sense of disempowerment, as if we can't be in charge of our world because trauma has happened to us. Number two, a sense of disconnection from others. We're not really connecting the way we usually do, even though we're maintaining our attachments through the media and through phone, etc. Connection has separated us because of social distancing, as well as the third effect, which is a loss of faith in an orderly world. Many of us, when we've gone through trauma, begin to say, where is God in all of this? And we begin to really challenge our faith. So recovery from this traumatic experience for all of us across the world right now involves a sense of empowerment, gaining some control over things that we have lost control over. Number two, a sense of reconnection and the establishment of new attachments with people that can help us feel as if we're not alone in the world. And lastly, to recognize that we are always in the hands of God, Hashem, and that in the words of Rav Soloveitchik, we have dvikut, we have a cleaving, an appreciation, and a love that is between man and God that carries us through all of our dark days. So when we work on these three features of recovery from trauma, we will find that we will feel better. And I've delineated 8 different strategies to help you make that happen more clearly. But before we do talk about these strategies, I want to just give a general background and appreciation of we in the Jewish faith and our history of a Jewish people, what we understand about how trauma and darkness ultimately leads to a place of light, to a place of acquired wisdom. Because everyone here in this world is here so our souls can learn. And certainly now our souls are being asked to learn a lot. We read from the very beginning of Breshit. Perhaps the first trauma in the Torah story is in Adam and Eve in the Gan Eden. And it says, for God knows that on the day that you shall eat of the tree of good and of the knowledge of fruit, knowledge of good and evil, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. This is perhaps the first place we discover that there is a challenge where evil subsists alongside good. We all recognize that the waves of chaos can oftentimes come crashing down on the shores of safety. We recognize from the very beginning of the Torah the state of things when God first spoke in Breshit is that the earth was unformed and void with darkness over the surface of the deep. And we appreciate that to mean that the waters may have already been there. The waters represent chaos. And that is our job. With God's help, we partner with Hashem to create order in a world that was once filled with chaos. The problem is that modern contemporary man has the same task that was set before us with Adam, Eve, and the serpent back in the garden. We have to challenge our efforts at fighting chaos, which exists always throughout time. We see this in the history of the Jewish people, the dialectic, if you will, of the pendulum of good versus evil swings in both directions. Let me just go backwards in terms of our Jewish history. We recognize this through Adam's conflict with the serpent. We see this with Cain's struggle with Abel, with Noah's discord in his generation of sinners. We recognize the pendulum swing with Abraham's relationship with Terach, his father, and the idols that his father was building. Isaac's relationship with Ishmael. Jacob's struggle with the angel in the dark night of his soul when he discovered that when fighting with his own identity, his own demons, he would be released and gifted and rewarded as Israel. The deaths of Nadab and Abihu, who brought strange fire to the altar in the Mishkan, but afterwards being consumed by the fire, taught all of us about the value of life, both here as well as in the spirit world. The Israelites in their journey through the desert and the ultimate reward of reaching the promised land. Jonah in the belly of the whale, who sat in darkness and asked God to please take him, and God said, sit a while, because there's more to be learned. And Job in his fatal tempest, his whirlwind of danger and despair, where he was rewarded tenfold in the world to come because of his faith and his dveikut. We see that through trauma, man triumphs, and that the Jewish history that we've experienced is showing us that in our darkness, we will find light, that in the pain exists spiritual, emotional, and psychological wealth for which we can learn how to live a better life in the end. So I want to start right in with the different types of strategies with an eye towards Tanakh, so that we can all learn to live a better life in the face of and in spite of the darkness that we are presently sitting inside of. It starts with my belief in the power of story. Number one, the power of story. The narrative approach to telling someone we care about what we're going through. There's a restorative quality in the way that we tell our story. And every one of us who's been through a trauma, and that includes all of us now in the world, has a story to tell. A story of woe, a story of sorrow, a story of fear, of what is yet to come perhaps. And when we find a listener who's capable of hearing our story in all of its details, we begin the process of healing. And let me tell you why. There are several reasons. Number one, we don't enter into trauma. Trauma enters into us. We never asked for these things to happen, but they did. They descended upon us, like the whirlwind and the tempest in the story of Job. And so we need to let that trauma out. We need to show it the window, show it the door, if you will. And the way we do that is by summoning our memories and letting them out through dialogue. The more we talk about what we've been through, what we feel, to someone who's capable of listening, the more we release it to the universe that can handle it better than we can. We gain control. And as we said when we started this lecture, we gain control over something that we lost control from. That's number one. Number two, in telling our story, it helps us from minimizing what we've been through. Many of us have been to a shiva, to a house of mourning, and we hear a well-intentioned visitor say to a mourner any number of things such as, God only gives us what we can handle, or heaven needed another flower, or everything works out for the best. And while that may be a kind statement to the mourner, it really is more effective for the person who's saying it. It acts as a salve or a balm for the speaker. But those of us who are in grief know that words rarely penetrate the soul and the heart of those of us in avelut, in grief. And what we really need is someone to just listen to our story and validate that it is something that has happened to us. This starts in our Torah, in Genesis, in Chayesar. We see the first example of our ability to listen to someone, have someone listen to us when we see Adam in verse 23, number 3. Abraham rises from having sat down after Sarah's death. And we learn that this can maybe be the first time we see about the mourning process. We also discover that Joseph had mourned for his father 7 days and stood up after 7 days, a few chapters later. We understand that through this process, we recognize that Shiva provides us with the prescriptions and the directions for helping us heal while we're in mourning. And we know that when we pay a Shiva call to a house of a mourner, halachically, we are not supposed to say a word. We don't say a thing until the mourner speaks first. And then when they speak, we ask about their feelings, about their statements. And that's because we're here to help them release their emotions, not the other way around. And so if we recognize this as a template for the healing process, we could also appreciate that every one of us who has a story of sorrow to tell will find a place of healing through the telling of story. That's where the power of narrative comes in. So when you find yourself being overwhelmed by the things that are happening these days, whether you see too much exposure in the news, or you hear too much on social media or from a friend about something that happened to someone that you care about, it's very important that you tell your story to someone who can hear it. It gives you a sense of control over what happened to you. It gives you a sense that you won't be minimized for what you feel. And ultimately, it helps you, more than anything else, to tell your story to the ultimate listener. And isn't that what Tefillah and Talmud Torah is all about? Sharing our story with Hashem so God can hear it and take it and ultimately heal us in our prayer. There we have strategy number one. Strategy number two is what I call cognitive restructuring. I want to help you understand what I mean by this. Cognitive restructuring basically means that every one of us creates an internal world with the things that we say to ourselves. We don't even realize sometimes that we are saying things that are not always so nice. There are times we might actually say to ourselves, under our breaths, I can't do much more of this. I can't take it. We're not going to make it out of this. We won't survive this. These statements, these unconscious, unbidden comments are being made under our breaths sometimes. And if we catch ourselves, we recognize that we're creating an internal world of darkness and negativity. And therefore, we have to stop ourselves from these internal phrases and think more positively. When we structure our thoughts in a positive frame, we actually rise above our sense of sorrow and self-loathing. We become healthier. We see this in Tanakh. We see this in our Torah in so many places. Perhaps the first place is in Akedah, in the story of the Akedah. We have Abraham who places Isaac on the altar. And there's a midrash in which we understand that Abraham, nichamti, he turns his perspective and he sees a ram caught in a thicket, and that becomes the sacrifice in place of Isaac. Nichamti has its root, its shoresh in the word Nachum, which means comfort. And it makes us wonder if perhaps in changing our perspective, the way Abraham changed his, we will gain greater comfort. We need to be more like Abraham and change the way we see certain things so that we actually recognize that there is a future for the Jewish people, for all of mankind. Number two, in our Torah, we think about Vayishlach. I think about how Jacob had his night with the angel as he was running to meeting his nemesis Esau. And he wrestles with an angel. And we understand in the words of the Torah that the angel, that Joseph says to the angel, Vayivater Yaakov levado, v'yavek ish imo ad alot hashachar. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. But take a look at the word play that the Torah has us look at right now. We have the words Yaakov and Yavek. Ve'yiv ater Yaakov levado, ve'yavek ish imo. Interestingly enough, Yavek and Yaakov are the same word with a shift in letters. And when we recognize that Yaakov, spelled with an ayin, Yaveks, spelled with an aleph, we begin to think perhaps what the Torah is telling us is that when every one of us, like Yaakov, wrestles with the aleph, which is the first letter in the word ani, when we wrestle with ani, with ourselves, with our own fears, with our own worries, with our own demons, we, like Yaakov, become blessed. Because we learn that when the dawn comes, the angel says, I must leave you now. And Yaakov says, I want to let you leave until you bless me. Every one of us can learn from this parasha that we are all blessed when we struggle and wrestle with ani, with the aleph inside of Yavek. And we become the leader of the nation, the covenant, just like Jacob. There's so much to be gained simply from our parashiot about how we can learn through darkness to find light. Interestingly, we learn that this sentence ends with alot hashachar, the break of dawn. But if you take a look literally at the translation, alot hashachar means the lifting of darkness, of the dark. And it interests me because it makes me think, as a grief therapist, as a trauma therapist, that every one of us that wrestles with the dark will ultimately be blessed with alot hashachar, with the lifting of the dark into a way of life that's filled with light, eternal light, if you will. We see also the cognitive restructuring in Shalech Lecha, when we have our scouts, 12 scouts that are sent to the land of Canaan to find out what life is like there. 12 come back and 10 say it's an awful place. And they say to Moshe Rabbeinu, they're as tall as grasshoppers. They can destroy us if we go there. But there's a midrash that suggests that maybe, just maybe, those Canaanites saw us, the Israelites, the scouts, as grasshoppers, that they shifted their perspective. They were afraid of us, not the other way around. And lastly, when you think about the Rephaim, the giants in our Torah, the last of the Rephaim is Goliath. And David and Goliath had a fight. And we're told that David wins as a little young man to a large giant. But we also can change our perspective and recognize that perhaps David won by making his own perspective of self as tall and as grand as that of the Rephaim, as that of the giant Goliath. Perhaps it was an even match because David saw himself as tall as Goliath was. What I'm suggesting to you metaphorically, as well as spiritually, is that when we change our cognitive structures and we reframe the way we see our sorrows, we rise above and become stronger and more capable of living a future filled with light and strength and hope. Let's move to strategy number 3, which is maintaining connection. It's so very important, particularly now that in this time of isolation and constriction and confinement, that we maintain and manage connection with the other. Why? Because when we are depressed and we are lonely and isolated, we begin to think that we're the only one that feels this way. We think that our world is very small, but when we connect with others who speak the language that we speak, who go through what we are going through, we recognize that we are not alone in this universe, that we share a common goal and we share a common struggle. Interestingly, if we look at the Parashat Truma, it's a beautiful parasha about building of the Mishkan in the desert. And we're taught in terms of Truma that we are to build the Kruvim. We're to build the ark, the Aron HaKodesh, with the Kruvim, the angels facing one another over the ark. And we're told that when we do this, this is where Hashem will come, between the faces of the Kruvim. Now, if we think about this from a spiritual or symbolic perspective, this means that if the angels face one another, God will show up. What it also means is that if we, as humans, face the other, and we look into the eyes of the other, as Martin Buber refers to as the I and the thou, we will experience God. And so we must learn to stand in the shoes of the other, experience what it must be like to be that other person. We can only do that, as the Parashat Truma tells us, by working on our relationships and maintaining important connections with one another. I also talk about the power of mirror neurons. Neuroscience in the last 10 years has revealed that we have mirror neurons, which means that when we look into the eyes of the other, we actually get a charge. A neurotransmitter shift in our brains, dopamine and norepinephrine, begin to course through our blood veins and our brainstem in a way that gives us a sense of buoyancy and hope. And so when we look into the eyes of another, we not only symbolically see the face of God, we also neurologically feel a sense of buoyancy and hope. That is how managing connections can help us break the isolation and constriction we feel during this time of confinement and fear. Number 4, physical self-care. Physical self-care is so very important, and it involves many, many things. It involves cardio exercise to whatever level you and your body are capable of. Because when we sweat, when we get our heart rate up, we are also engaging neurotransmitters the endorphins. We get that endorphin high, that rush, that feeling of electricity in our brains, because we are engaging our brainstem with the rest of our body, the mind-body connection. So manage some type of physical fitness and care in your day, every day. What I do between every teletherapy session is I get down and do 10 push-ups. By the end of the day, I've done 100 push-ups. The blood flows and my mind thinks more clearly. There's something else that I recommend people do, and that's when you squeeze your fingertips. You squeeze for 10 seconds until you can feel your nails going into the palms of your hands. When you open your hands, you discover that the tips of your fingers are white. Why is that? That's because the blood that's the tip of the digits is now going straight to your heart. And when you get married under a chuppah, the rabbi says, place the ring on your bride or groom's index finger, because symbolically there's an artery straight to the heart. So when we squeeze our fingertips, what we're doing is we're forcing blood to go to the heart, which forces oxygen in the blood to go to the brain. And we feed our brain instantly. And so when we are not thinking clearly, we squeeze our fingertips and feed our brain and don't even realize how now our brains are thinking more clearly. This is part of physical fitness. In terms of physical self-care, it also involves getting in touch with the elements of nature, taking a walk outside, feeling the sun on the back of your neck, feeling the wind on your face and your hair. This also triggers neurotransmitters in our brains and gives us a sense of life and light. So get outside, especially now, at least in this part of the hemisphere. For my friends in Australia and New Zealand, they're entering into winter, but we here are entering into spring and summer. Let's take advantage of the good weather, the vitamin D, and feel the sense of hope that nature provides and brings to us. There's also, number 5, I call spiritual self-care. Spiritual self-care is so very important. We could spend hours on it. I only want to spend a few moments on it, unfortunately. We remember from our Torah when God says to Moshe, I want you to take the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt. We read about this very soon in our Passover Haggadah. But we also know that Moses said the famous words, who am I? Who am I that I shall be leading the Jewish people out of the land of Egypt? And God said, you are the man I have chosen. Every one of us has been chosen spiritually to lead ourselves, our families, our loved ones out of the darkness that we are right now enslaved within. And so like Moshe Rabbeinu, we have a charge to spiritually find the light. How do we do that? Well, there are so many ways that we have a spiritual arousal and a spiritual awakening inside of us. It doesn't mean that we have to have a religious affiliation or how much of our religious affiliation is attached to the actual words we study, as much as we have what Soloveitchik calls dvekut, a relationship like devek, the shorish for glue, devek. There's a oneness, a cleaving between God and man that I call the God and man reunion, where together we work as partners. The greatest partnership we know of in our world is the partnership between God and mother, God and woman, who creates life with the help of God to continue to bring the covenant forward for the generations ahead of us. We cannot do this without God's help. God cannot do this without our help. We are partners in this together. But the beautiful concept of dvekut, in English meaning cleaving, is that we have 2 definitions for the word cleaving. And in the English language, they are completely opposite. Cleaving can mean cutting completely across, cutting off, like when you cleave the leg of a piece of meat when you cut it off. You separate completely. But cleaving also means to be incredibly attached and unified. And I think that the metaphor is beautiful because none of us can cleave without both a craving for independence as well as a need and a desire for union. That's the human condition. That's the spiritual condition. We are striking out to have an independent life, while at the same time, we are always connected to God, Hashem, always with us. I want to talk about number 6, which is creating future plans. Future plans, future-oriented thinking is so important at a time such as now. I want everyone to think about what they're going to do when we finally are out of quarantine. Who's the first person you want to hug? What kind of plans do you have for the summer? Those bar mitzvahs and weddings that had to be put off. How will you now resurrect them and create them anew? Make those plans now, because when we have something to look forward to, we rise out of our depression. We come out of our darkness because we have something to look forward to. Depression, by some psychoanalytic theorists, has been likened to a loss of plan. So the absence of plan creates darkness. Therefore, now is a time to start making those plans so that when the sun shines, we are ready to join the sun, join the outside, and follow through with everything we planned in this moment of darkness. Lastly, I want to talk about what I call the self-love triad. The triad of self-love involves knowing your private audience. It involves your personal resume, as well as thinking about whose life is better simply because you're in it. Now, let me see if I can go slowly. What is a private audience? A private audience is that 1 or 2 people that you perform to when you are thinking or going on stage. It's opening night, if you will, and you're afraid that the people in the audience are going to judge you and you're going to forget your lines. Or you're about to go on the pulpit and read the Haftorah and you're afraid you're going to mess up. You don't perform to the audience that's in the shul. You perform to your private audience. That's perhaps that 1 or 2 people who know you at your best. That's that letter that you keep tucked in the back of your wallet, yellowed from tears and time, that reminds you of how this one person thinks so highly of you, or that message on your answering machine that you constantly remember and never, ever erase, because it's someone in your life who told you that you're great and that those words meant so much to you. The people on our private audience don't even have to be in this world. Likely they are in the other world, Olam Haba. They've left our world, but they're still always with us. Their neshama is always telling us, I believe in you. That is our private audience. So when you spend time focusing on who's in your private audience, you carry yourself with greater confidence. The second part of the personal self-care triad, self-love triad, is noticing your personal resume of life. That doesn't mean where you went to college or grad school or what kind of a career you have, although that helps as well. What it means is that you take an inventory of what's on your own personal resume. Who you helped in this life? Who is better because of you? What are the things you've done that remind you of who you are when you're at your best? Because every one of us can be at our best, even though at times, such as now, we feel as if we're at our worst. Who were we when we did the right things, when we changed someone's life? That inventory on our personal resume will make us feel a lot better about who we are. It'll help us recognize that we were born and made in the image of Hashem, and that we have God inside of each and every one of us. The last part of the personal self-love triad is very simply, who's that one person whose life is better simply because you love them? I often tell this story of a young man I worked with who had cancer, 30 years old, very sick. And he one day said to me, I want you to know, Doc, that you are number 2 on my speed dial on my BlackBerry. And I said to him, what does that mean? And he said, well, I won't do it, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm on my way to the emergency room and I'm in an ambulance and I think I might be dying. I know that if I just press the number 2 on my BlackBerry, you will be there. I remember those days. That was 10 years ago. My dear patient, my dear friend did succumb to cancer, but I'll always remember what he taught me about love, which is that when someone believes in you, you rise above your own sense of self-pity and self-loathing. And this young man believed in me and taught me that my love of him and for him made his life better. Whose life is better, I ask each of you, simply because you love them? That's going to give you a sense of purpose and value and remind each and every one of you that we were all made in the image of Hashem. that Hashem lives inside of us, is that we all need to regulate our days very carefully. We need to create order in our days, because without that, like we see from Bereshit, we can all go towards chaos. Structure regulates emotion. When we have a purpose in our day, we actually find ourselves less depressed. And so even if you're not going to work right now, I would recommend that you wake up, take a shower, get dressed, and go into the other room as if you are going to attack the day from the perspective of work or some other important task. Keep order and structure in your day so that you have points of your day when you have a well-earned break, and points of your day when you are using your mind and your body to create a stimulating change in the world. At the end of the day, you can rest and say, I've done a good job today and participated in some way in the world that God has helped us to all to live in. But structure must be maintained, even and particularly, especially during this time of confinement and quarantine. The last piece I want to mention is stress reduction. Stress reduction involves any number of techniques such as yoga, meditation, guided imagery, visualization techniques. There are apps on your phone that you can download that help you just close your eyes and listen to a soft voice take you on a metaphoric journey. Oftentimes I travel with my patients down a symbolic elevator ride from the 10th floor to the 9th floor, all the way down to the first floor. And as we do, the muscles in our bodies are getting softer and more at ease. There are so many ways that we can manage calm and maintain proper breathing as well as proper thought, so that during this time of stress, we practice techniques in stress reduction. I hope all of you have benefited from these 8 points of self-care and management of calm. I hope all of you can recognize in your Torah, in your appreciation of our Tanakh, how each parasha and how every stage that talks and codifies the parashiot, can teach us about self-care and continuing the journey, the reunion between man and God, dveikut between our Hashem and our inner souls, so that we can improve this world, not just from the place we are in today, but from where we are now to the eternal future.
How should everybody as a community be addressing like all this? Like, should we be making extra efforts for connecting, and a lot of people who are alone? Yeah,
it's important that we remember that the folks in the elder part of our population are not as adept, or if at all adept, at social media. And so it's not easy for many folks who did not grow up in a society with computers to understand FaceTime and Zoom and Snapchat and even texting. And so it's really important that we go out of our way to reach out to those that are in pure confinement. And that means making an old-fashioned telephone call, because it's important that we don't forget those that are our elders who lived a life before us that didn't involve any of this social media. This is the pure, true definition of chesed. This is where Abraham starts. Abraham always escorted his guests to the door of the tent and never, ever left them to walk themselves out. In the same way, we want to always escort our elders to the next part of the world they live in. The only way we can do that is speaking their language and using their media, which might be a telephone, it might be a letter in the mail. Reach people where they're at. And if we can meet each other where we're at, we will help each other from being less alone. And in particular, this population is very much in need of that.
Dr. Fried?
Yes.
I really appreciate those comments about structure. And, I have a daughter at home with me. Many people are struggling with kids in isolation, kids in self-quarantine, kids in the home. Sometimes there are parents together now with their kids for the first time in years and decades. We have elder people either separate on their own or with families for the first time in sometimes decades. Tell us a little bit more. What's your advice about structure? Up at 7, up at 8, lunch at 12. Is there some semblance of being too rigid versus not rigid enough. What's your advice? And I know we can go any direction with that.
You're making a very good point, Gershon. It's important that we maintain structure, but it's also very wise not to be so rigid, particularly at a time such as now, that we end up finding ourselves fighting with our kids, teenagers, because they're not following the structure that we think they should. I have so many patients who are calling me now just so disappointed in their kids, their teenage children, because they're not handing in remote assignments or sitting in a remote classroom from the computer. And there's so much strife, there's so little shalom by it. And I don't think it's worth it. I think that it's important. There's a significant difference between being right and being happy, and you have to make that decision. Yes, it's right to finish all the work that's required of us in our day, but it's not going to keep everybody so happy. Once in a while, it would be okay to say, khalash, leave it be. I'm going to let that one lighten up, because the schools themselves are now turning to pass-fail. All universities are giving that option, many high schools as well. And we appreciate from the perspective of teachers and professors that we can't expect what we would have expected if the child was sitting in our room. Please remember that there are many among us who are in quarantine in homes that are not necessarily safe. There are children whose parents should not be married but have an in-house separation because of the quarantine. There are people who feel as if there is an aggressor in the home, someone who's drinking, someone who's making them uncomfortable. There's lots of noise going on in the other room. There's animals running around, dogs and cats. We can't expect our children and teenagers to perform as well with as much vigilance as we would have had they attended the actual environments that we planned in the beginning. And so there is a place for a little sablanut, for a little patience. Yes, structure regulates affect, but also heart and spirit help with mood. So once in a while, it's okay to say, the gig isn't to hate. You can't do this. We can let that one go. There's a combination between super rigidity and super lax chaos. Somewhere in the middle is the right way to handle it.
You've brought up, you walked through a number of different tests in the Tanakh, and you brought up stories of our patriarchs, and I've heard you speak other places more of that. I was just reading in Bereshit, which you were referencing, the whole story of the Akida. And it was funny how I was reading it, and it said, and it came to pass, I'm reading from Chabad.org library on Bereshit, using their translation, chapter 22. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. And then we go into the story, take your son, take him to the land of Moriah, et cetera, and we know that story. And I stopped and I said that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. And then the Akida story. So evidently there were tests before that got to this ultimate test. I was taken back by that. And then I thought back of all the things that Abraham was put through before. In the commentary, in the Hertz Tanakh commentary to the Akida, page 74, it says, a test is never employed for the purpose of injury, but to certify the power of resistance. And that really, really struck me. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about resistance? And right now, where is resistance in our life healthy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and where is resistance in our life not healthy?
You're asking so many questions. I want to jump in and see if I can answer a little bit of the first part of your question. Please understand that in terms of Tanakh, not Talmud, but Tanakh, the Akeda is one of the first tests that we learn of. But we also know that the word test is Nisa. God tests Abraham. But inside the shorish of Nisa is the word Nes, which is miracle. And that from every test comes a miracle. Please also understand that nowhere in our parasha does it say anything about Abraham being told to bring Isaac to slaughter. That was Abraham's interpretation. It said, raise Isaac ka'oleh, as an elevation. And there are many sages with many interpretations of what that means. What's most important is that this is the first time in the Akedah that we, in the Torah, that we hear of the word love. Take your son, God says, sha'ahavta, that you love so much, and bring him to the mount. Why now is the word love appearing when we had Noah and his ark, and we had Adam and Eve and the beginning of time? But here is where the word love shows up. And for me, it means that it is through the tests of our lifetime that we experience the journey and the reward of love. Abraham did not want to, in some ways, we don't want to believe that Abraham wanted to slaughter his son as much as he wanted to elevate his son. And in many interpretations and many codifying documents of this particular story, it's interpreted as a letting go of sending Isaac off into the world. Isaac was in his 20s at the time of, actually he was 32 at the time of the Akedah. And so one can interpret this as, I'm setting you free to the world the way I must. And so we understand that love becomes the greatest test. We see it in this parasha, we see it in the word nisa, which is test, and we see it in the shoresh nes, which is miracle. With love, we'll be tested and we'll find the miracle.
Oh, it's magnificent. Thank you. Yes, Koach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, again, for taking the time.
Thank you. My pleasure. I really appreciate it.
We really appreciate your help, and I'm sure that you're going to affect a lot of people right before the holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, everybody.